I'm trying to get out of the sunlight. Yeah, so welcome everyone to our second uh, lecture of the TEK Talk lecture series. I'm very excited to have Andy join us today. Before we start, as Margaret said, please keep your microphones muted during the talk. If you are calling in on a phone, you can do that with *6. If you have questions, just as last time, you can post them in the chat, and Margaret and I will register them and then relay them to Andy after his talk. We have sent him some of the questions that you sent in prior to his talk, so he might be answering some of them in his lecture anyways. You can also raise your hand with *9 on the phone and unmute yourself and ask your question directly after his talk if you want to. With that, I would like to thank GIGSA, the Geophysical Institute Graduate Student Association, for helping us host this lecture series. And I would like to acknowledge that many of us are in Fairbanks, at least Margaret and I are, and Fairbanks built on the unceded lands of the Lower Tanana Dene. And I just thought I'd briefly share this with you because I'm still very new to doing land acknowledgements, and I think some of you might be too. And so I'm still kind of nervous of like getting the wording wrong or, you know, conveying the wrong message. And I've been talking to Margaret, and I think she really helped me understand that if you do a land acknowledgement, like what really counts or what you're trying to do is, you know, what is the message that you're trying to send out and why are you doing it? And so I think for me, it really is that I want to acknowledge that we live in a history-driven present, and that I really want to be intentional about my relations to the land I'm on and to the people that are indigenous to the land. And so I just thought I'd share this to maybe open up the space for those that aren't very familiar with land acknowledgements and who might feel a little uneasy about them, because I do think they're important and they're really good to have if you open up a meeting or a class or any other shared space. And with that, I'd like to welcome Andy. I'm very excited. He's an associate research professor here at the Geophysical Institute at UAF. Andy knows a lot about the geophysics of sea ice. I know him from a class I'm taking with him right now on sea ice geophysics. He's one of my 3 teachers, and Margaret knows him from a project they're doing up in Utqiagvik. And we really appreciate Andy's perspective on working with and for Indigenous people up north. And so be very happy to have you here. And so welcome, Andy.
Hey, thank you, Annika, and thank you for starting with the land acknowledgement. I think that is a great way to open a talk like this, and as you say, sort of create that space for discussion that's going to follow. So I'll get right onto it. Let's see. Hopefully, you guys are now looking at the next slide with the TEK Talk title and sea ice research and the meaning of ice, and an illustration by a hunter from Clyde River in Canada in the background there. So as Annika mentioned, by my academic training, I'm a sea ice geophysicist, but I feel privileged that I've managed to work in communities for exactly the same amount of time as I've been studying sea ice in an academic setting. And so I feel that I've managed to learn about sea ice from 2 perspectives in parallel. And I really value the perspective that has given me. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a lag when I move from slide to slide. So I'm going to try and move to the next slide and then hopefully give a bit of time for that to update on everyone's screen. So there's 2 projects that I'd really like to single out and acknowledge. The first of them is the Siku Inuit Hila project, which means sea ice, people, and weather in 3 different northern languages, representing the communities of Utqiagvik, Alaska, Kanak in Greenland, and Clyde River in Nunavut. This was a project that was very formative for me, one of the postdoc projects I worked on at the University of Colorado, and a real privilege for me to get to learn about sea ice from elders and hunters from 3 different communities, as the whole project team learnt by traveling to each community and having this cross-cultural, cross-generational discussion with elders and younger hunters and young early career researchers like myself at the time. One of the products of this project was a book called The Meaning of Ice, and I borrowed the title of that book for the title of this talk. Full disclosure, I'm a co-editor of this book. I consider that one of the great privileges of my research career so far, that I was involved in that book. But that doesn't affect my recommendation for you to read read this book if you get a chance. It's a wonderful book about sea ice and people who live with sea ice. Another project that I'd really like to acknowledge is the Ecological project. This translates roughly to ice bridges. This is a project based out of Kotzebue, Alaska. It's an ongoing project, one that I'm currently involved with, and this one was funded by the Moore Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And what was, I think, unique about this, and actually one of the reasons that the Moore Foundation were keen to fund it, was it was an opportunity for us to start a project with an almost entirely blank slate in terms of research questions. And we spent the first year working with community members, coming up with what our research questions should be. We have an Indigenous Advisory Council of 4 elders from the community of Kotzebue: John Goodwin, Cyrus Harris, Bobby Schaefer, and Ross Schaefer. And under their advice and guidance, we developed the research questions and the research design that we've been following for the 4 years since then. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail about this project coming up, but those are 2 projects that really underpin a lot of my understanding of how to do sea ice research whilst maintaining an Indigenous perspective and following a knowledge co-production approach. So let's see if we move on, hopefully, to the next slide. Here we go. Part of working with, I think, a Native community on your chosen discipline is understanding how your view of a discipline and a subject matter might vary from the people in the community you're working with. So this is a word cloud put together with words that were culled from all the abstracts that were submitted to volume 57 of the Annals of Glaciology. That was a specific volume about sea ice that came out in 2010. And the size of each word represents the relative frequency with which that word was used. So you can see here that thickness and data and model were really, really important terms that were used as scientists described their interaction with sea ice as a subject matter. For comparison, here is a word cloud taken from words written by or dictated by elders from the community of Okliagbek. It was called Barrow at that time, describing their life experience with sea ice. And you can see almost no overlap, actually, particularly in the largest words. Here, the largest words are whale and people and clothing and tools. And this, to me, really graphically captured the different viewpoint. And so if you're going to try and understand sea ice from a different point of view, or your subject matter from a different point of view, and include Indigenous knowledge about that subject matter, it's really important to understand what it is that's important. Why is this knowledge held by people? What's important for it? And so that in my case, I can ask the question, what is sea ice? And I can answer it from my academic background, and I can also listen to how other people from an Indigenous perspective answer that question. And one way to summarize what is sea ice, I believe from an Indigenous perspective, is that it can represent food, clothing, freedom, and home. And these are actually 4 chapters that emerged as common themes in the book, The Meaning of Ice, that I referenced earlier, that was co-authored by a team of academics and elders from 3 different communities around the Arctic. And so I'll go through a little more now on how sea ice can be thought of in these 4 themes, and that'll sort of help set the stage for thinking about sea ice from a joint academic and Indigenous perspective. So one way to think about sea ice is to think of it as a place to find food, and I found if you're having a discussion about sea ice with people from coastal communities in the Arctic, food comes up as a topic very quickly. In this case, here are whalers from the community of Ecological, cutting up a whale on the land-fast ice near the community, having recently caught that whale in skin boats launched from the sea ice. So that the sea ice is both a hunting platform as well as a platform on which to cut and prepare and share the whale that results from that hunt. In Greenland, fish is also a very important staple in their diet that's harvested from sea ice. Land-fast sea ice in the fjords offers access to deep water where these fish live, and they go ice fishing in waters as deep as 50 or 100 meters, running lines with hooks on all the way down to the seafloor and pulling up the halibut that come up. They're much smaller than Pacific halibut, but they're still caught in quite large numbers and form a staple food source in Canada and Greenland. And here's some data from Clyde River from 2004, showing the percentage by weight of different subsistence species. And you can see that ringed seal are more than 50% of the total weight of harvested subsistence foods in this community. Ringed seal themselves are ice-dependent species, and so they're hunted from the ice, either using nets underneath the ice, or also from the ice edge in the open water. And I want to sort of also bring up that sea ice can also be important for accessing drinking water. Although sea ice itself, first-year sea ice, contains too much salt to be melted and used as drinking water. In Greenland, in the community of Karnak, there's no freshwater lake that provides a year-round water supply. The springs that are fed from melting of the Greenland ice sheet, nearby glaciers, they run dry in the wintertime. And so instead, the community relies on harvesting blocks of ice from icebergs that get embedded in the sea ice during winter. And so the sea ice provides access to the freshwater drinking supply in the form of these chunks of glacier ice that are broken off the icebergs and then brought up to town. And every house has a chunk of iceberg sitting outside in wintertime for melting for drinking. The next theme I mentioned was sea ice as a source of clothing and tools. And here's a series of photographs representing different ways in which ice-based marine mammals are used as clothing and tools. Lena Holm, some people might know her from the Inupiat Circumpolar Council, is wearing a very fetching pair of polar bear pants there on the left. I still regret the fact that I didn't accept the offer to wear a pair of polar bear pants when I had the opportunity in Greenland. I'm told you'll never find a warmer pair of pants to wear. And in the middle, Julie Sangoya. He is the artist who painted the picture on my title slide. He's using a dog whip here that's made from braided strips of ring seal hide. And there's mittens on the bottom there made from ring seal fur. And on the right there in the bottom corner, that's an umiak in barrow made from the hides of bearded seals or ugrok. And another common theme that comes up when I've spoken with Indigenous people about sea ice in Greenland and Canada and the Arctic is the freedom that comes when the ice, when the water freezes over and you can travel more or less anywhere. And in many places, navigation is actually easier in wintertime than it is in summertime. Here's a young hunter going out on a hunting trip from Karnak, just as we were getting back ourselves from a 2-day dog sled ride further north up the coast. And there's just a sort of a movement and a freedom in this photograph that I think really goes well with the caption. These are some, hopefully you're all looking at a map of northern Baffin Island here, showing the travel routes taken during wintertime by community members traveling between communities and to hunting grounds. And you can see that these travel routes sort of cross over from land to ocean in ways that you can't do in the summertime. And so when the ocean freezes over, it allows access to all these different places. And the early freeze up season in Clyde River in Inuktitut is known as the news season, because it's when you get to see people for the first time that you've not seen for a long time over the summer and learn everything new that's happened. And that happens because you can travel again once the ocean freezes over. Now we're sort of moving back to Alaska. This is Barrow or Qiagvik. These are all the whaling trails that go out on the sea ice during the spring whaling hunt over several years, mapped by Matt Druckenmiller. And once again, this shows how sea ice is used for travel. It's a little different than in Canada. It's not the long distance travel, but nonetheless, it's travel over the sea ice that lets you get to the lead edge, which is where the whales can be hunted in the springtime. And lastly, and I think sort of summarizing everything that's come before, this all represents that sea ice is part of what makes the place home for people who live on the Arctic coast and live with sea ice. On the left is a photograph of Siorapaluk in northwest Greenland. It's the northernmost permanent community in the world. I had a wonderful reception there when we arrived after a long day of dog sledding from Karnak. I feel very privileged to have gotten to spend time in this wonderful community. And on the right is a set of goalposts in the sea ice in Karnak. I grew up in England, where every village with a flat space of grass would have some goalposts on it for playing football. So to me, seeing goalposts on the sea ice really encapsulated this idea of sea ice being a part of what it is to be home to a community and children in all aspects of life. So with this concept in mind that sea ice represents many facets of life for the people who live there, to do research on sea ice academically involving the community takes an approach that has to start at the beginning of the research process. And I think this is something that I have recently learned in my research career, and I think it's something that's gaining traction more broadly throughout the Arctic research community. The diagram on the right is a sort of a classic arrow and bubble diagram that we as researchers submit to funding agencies to get funding. But it shows the cyclic nature of knowledge production. There's a lot of arrows that go back and forth indicating exchange of knowledge and ideas, leading to a sort of a central goal that's one that everyone is invested in. And in this particular project, around the edge, the outer circle is labeled video documentary. And this particular project, Geophysical, we felt it was very important to document our story of this project, not just in the typical scientific literature that is the mode that scientists typically communicate in, but a video documentary that is a lot more closely aligned with the oral history traditions that the community of Kotzebue that we're working with has relied to pass on knowledge for generations. And so I think, to me, this figure, there's a lot of detail in it. I'll make my slides available later for anyone who's interested, but there's a lot that goes on here that describes the interactions and overall view that I think are important for working successfully and effectively with communities, not just for one project, but in a way that provides continuity for other projects and research to continue afterwards. Oops, I'll just pop back a slide here. Hopefully you're all looking at the slide with the circle and arrow diagram. The bottom, there's a blue box there labeled research questions, and there's arrows going into that, local and indigenous knowledge and scientific capabilities. I mentioned one of the really unique aspects of the Ecological project was that we had a year at the beginning to come up with our research questions in partnership with the Indigenous community. And this next video, I hope the video plays for everyone over Zoom. If not, again, I can make this available afterwards for people to play back at their own speed. But this video shows, gives an idea of what it's like in practice, working with the community to come up with, to do knowledge co-production. This is kind of a video of knowledge co-production in practice. This was our team coming in summer. You'll notice there's no sea ice here. We're here to look at sea ice. But we arrived at a time when there was no sea ice, and you can see in the background is literally a blank whiteboard. We started this project with basically the idea that we wanted to look at sea ice. That was something we'd heard from the community. And quite quickly, that whiteboard, we actually had to get a bigger whiteboard. You can see that whiteboard started to fill up with questions that we came up with together. And I think what's really important is here, we came up with questions that were phrased in such a way to bring together ideas that we would not have come up with as scientists ourselves. We had marine mammal scientists, we had oceanographers, we had people who were really experienced in satellite data and sea ice. And I don't think if we'd sat in the room without, there's John Goodwin, without John and Bobby there on the right, and Ross and Cyrus, we wouldn't have come up with the same set of questions without their guidance. The questions that we did come up with, I'll go into in more detail coming up. There's Cyrus Harris, one of the other elders on our committee, on our advisory council. The answers that we came up with are much more holistic and integrated and cross-cutting between different parts of the Arctic system than we would have come up with on our own without the advisory council. And that's Ross Schaefer on the right. Chris Zappa there in the check shirt. He's the lead PI of the Ecological project. And those are some drones that we flew as kind of the centerpiece of the project was a sustained aerial drone campaign over Kotzebue Sound. And essentially some of the research questions were derived from the basis asking the elders, what would you do if you could fly around getting a picture anywhere you wanted of Kotzebue Sound? What would you want to look at? What questions would you like to answer? So hopefully that video played for everyone. That's kind of a sneak preview of a video documentary that's going to be coming out about our project here in the next few months. There'll definitely be announcements about that in due course. And as I said, telling our story through a video documentary is a really important aspect of this project, and we've sort of integrated it right from the beginning, as you can see. So, okay, going to the next slide. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to go briefly through all the questions that we came up with that ended up driving our research design. This is a photo of the whiteboard at the end of our several-day meeting with the advisory council. And the first question, it got called question 0 in the end. What species of marine mammals and birds occupy the lead system west of Kotzebue Sound prior to breakup of sea ice within the sound? Now, there's a lot going on in this question that in order to understand this question, answer this question, you had to understand about the evolution of sea ice outside of Kotzebue Sound during the springtime, at the time when a lot of the marine mammals are arriving. So this is a question that's sort of steeped in the local knowledge of how the seasons evolve with the ice and the species happening at the same time of year each year. The next question that followed from that, what environmental factors control marine mammal use of Kotzebue Sound? The questions themselves, they're phrased in the language that we use as scientists, but each question was initiated by discussion that the elders led. What environmental factors control the length of the bearded seal hunting season in Kotzebue Sound? What determines ice transport processes in Kotzebue Sound? What snow and ice surface properties promote ring seal den integrity and pupping success? Again, very sort of scientific language that we used afterwards, but this was the language that we all agreed on that captured everything. That was not exactly obviously the question that was initiated by the elders. Question 5, what role does sea ice play in sediment transport and deposition in Kotzebue Sound? There's a lot of changes taking place with coastal erosion, and the elders are very concerned about what role sea ice has with that. And lastly, this question didn't arrive at the beginning of the project, but as sort of another important factor is to be able to be responsive to changes happening through the project. We realized that as we got going, we had to ask the question, why was there so little sea ice in Kotzebue Sound in 2018 and 2019, which were the 2 primary years that we conducted field research. So if you look at all of these questions, 7 in total, most of them involve marine mammals at some level, which basically comes down to the topic of food. That was the first lens through which we looked at sea ice a few slides ago. I'm going to focus on 3 of these questions coming up next. That's question 2, 4, and 6. And I'm going to look at some results from research that's currently in review with peer-reviewed journals that address these 3 parts of these 3 questions. So to quickly provide some historical context, our 2 primary field seasons took place in 2018 and 2019, which are at the right-hand side of this graph, which shows average sea ice concentration in Kotzebue Sound and the waters just outside Kotzebue Sound, derived from the Alaska Sea Ice Atlas data, which goes back to the 1950s. And the take-home message from this plot is that over time, May has started to look like June, and June has started to look like July. Throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, sea ice concentration in May, June, and July occupied fairly separate ranges of variability. But in the last few years, and in 2018 and 2019 in particular, it looks like the months all got shifted. And now they're seeing in May conditions that they used to experience in June, and in June they're seeing conditions that they used to experience in July. And 2018 and 19 ended up being record-breaking ice conditions in terms of the lack of ice in the Kotzebue Sound region. A little more background is about the bearded seal hunting season in Kotzebue. Essentially, the start of the season happens when they can launch boats to get into the loose ice pack in Kotzebue Sound. And that is primarily controlled by when a channel manages to cut its way through the landfast ice right in front of town. And so on the left, there's a MODIS image showing sea ice in Kotzebue Sound on May 15th, 2016. And there's a little zoom in box there. And you can see a narrow channel that's been cut through the landfast ice by the waters from the Noatak and Selawik and Kobuk rivers that all enter into Kotzebue Sound through that channel. On the right is ice conditions around June 7th, 2016, which is when the hunt was largely over, according to observations made by Alex Whiting, who's kept a journal on these dates since 2003. And these are the dates that Alex Whiting kept in his journal, showing the start and beginning date, sorry, the start and end dates of bearded seal hunting in Kotzebue going back to 2003. The length of the bar therefore represents the duration of the bearded seal hunt, which is largely constrained by the ice conditions. People will hunt as long as there are bearded seal out there available to be hunted, and there's sea ice on which to hunt them. And as you can see, there's a lot of variability from year to year, but what's really noticeable is after around 2013, the length of the bearded seal hunting season got a lot shorter. And this is why this was one of the questions that came up with some urgency from our advisory council. The start of the bearded seal hunting season is very closely tied to the opening of that channel that I described. And so here's a scatter plot showing the first date that boats were launched based on Alex Whiting's journal. And sorry, on the left, the start of the hunting season, according to Alex Whiting's journal, and the date that boats can be launched in the channel based on an analysis of satellite imagery. And you can see there's a fairly linear relationship between the two. Boats, the hunting season starts when boats can be launched, is the short story here. So we knew that the channel in front of town was a very important aspect of bearded seal hunting. So we put a fairly intensive ice-based observing station in the ice of the channel. We had underneath, we had instruments measuring the current and temperature of the ocean and salinity. Frozen into the ice, we had instruments that measure ice thickness and snow depth, and above the ice, we had a weather station measuring wind speed and air temperature and solar radiation. I'm going to go into a bit more detail now about the sea ice observations that we made specifically. Of course, I'm a sea ice geophysicist. I'm going to focus in on these data. The photos on the left show Vince Schaefer from the community of Kotzebue making measurements of ice thickness and snow depth at the mass balance station that was part of that ice observatory that I just showed in the last slide. And here's the measurements for 2018. And what was really surprising in this year is that the ice stopped growing in mid-February. There was plenty of cold weather left, and the ice was actually still relatively thin when the ice stopped. Well, the snow was relatively thin when the ice stopped growing. So we were quite surprised that the thickest ice we measured in 2018 was measured on February 13th. And after that, ice growth stopped, and actually the ice got a little thinner underneath. In 2019, we were kind of wondering if 2018 was just a quirk, something strange happening. In 2019, we saw even more extreme behavior. The ice stopped growing in January and actually rapidly started thinning. And in combination, the deep snow and thin ice led to flooding and refreezing of the snowpack on top of the ice. So a series of measurements that we were not expecting to see, very anomalous, but related to what's going on with the channel and that determines when people can get out and hunt in the springtime. So we looked at this in quite a lot more detail, and we modeled ice growth in the channel based on the data that we had. We gave it the air temperature data and the snow depth. And over time, we looked at how the ice grew each year. And we let the model add heat to the bottom of the ice so that our modeled ice thickness matched the observed ice thickness. And what we found in 2018 was that throughout the winter, there was heat coming into the bottom of the ice of around about 10 watts per meter squared that was slowing the ice growth down. That seemed pretty interesting. Sorry, I'm trying to there, gone to the next slide. But again, we weren't sure if that was anomalous. So we looked at conditions in 2019. And again, we modeled the ice growth based on the snow depth and the air temperature at the surface. And in order to match the observations, we had to have an ocean heat flux that by the end of spring was almost 3 times as much heat coming out of the ocean as there had been in 2018. And in 2018, we already thought that was an unexpectedly large amount of heat coming in to the ice from below. So this residual ocean heat flux, we think, is a really important part of why sea ice in Kotzebue Sound has been so anomalous in the past. We thought initially that maybe the amount of flooding at the snow surface may have slowed ice growth down at the bottom. But it turns out if you take the snow ice formation away, you don't actually end up with that much extra ice thickness. So in fact, if the snow ice hadn't formed by flooding, there would have been even less ice, and there may even have been open water in some parts of the channel as early as April if the snow hadn't flooded and refrozen on top. Measurements from underneath the ice really helped us clue in on where this heat was coming from. There's hot springs in the area around Kotzebue, and some people asked, well, are the rivers getting warmer? Is this heat from the river coming out and melting the sea ice in the middle of winter? Measurements from under the ice showed that the warm temperatures when the water was furthest from its freezing point coincided when the water was saltier. And so actually we think the heat was coming from the ocean side of Kotzebue Sound rather than the upstream in the rivers, which certainly makes sense given how much open water there was in both 2018 and 2019. So this left us asking, how unusual were 2018 and 2019 in terms of the ice thickness? Using historical air temperatures measured at the airport, we ran our model sort of backwards in time. And we found that if the snow and ocean conditions were the same as in 2019, then it's extremely unlikely you'd ever have had ice much more than 90 centimeters or 3 feet thick. But elders in the community unanimously said that the ice used to be at least 4 or 5 feet thick in the past based on how long an auger they had to use to go ice fishing. And so it's clear that it's unlikely that the snow and ocean conditions were as the snow was as deep or the ocean was as warm in the past as it was in 2019. And to get any time in the past when the ice was as thin as it was in 2019, we had to add half as much snow and half as much heat again from the ocean to have any time that looked like what we saw in 2019. So we are quite confident that 2019 was the thinnest ice year, the thinnest sea ice any time in since at least 1943 and probably a lot earlier, based on, 1946, based on weather data measured in Kotzebue Sound. So I guess I'll wrap up then by going back to the three questions I mentioned earlier. What environmental factors control the length of the bearded seal hunting season in Kotzebue Sound? This is one of the questions that came up from our advisory council. And we can say that the breakup of the channel is partly what controls the start of the hunting season. And the ice in the channel has been made thinner by bottom melt caused by heat from below, and we think the ocean is the primary cause of that heat. So from this, we can say that the start of the hunting season is controlled in part by how much heat can get into the ice from the ocean outside of Kotzebue Sound. Question 4 asked what snow and ice surface properties promote ringed seal den integrity and pupping success. Although the mass balance measurements we made didn't directly address this, other components of the Ecological project specifically went out and looked at seal layers and measured snow depth around them. But the measurements we made in the channel showed that if you have a combination of deep snow and thin ice, you can get flooding, and that flooding will be quite widespread. This photo in the background actually shows a flooded layer that we found elsewhere on the landfast ice. And although there is not much research on the impact of flooded layers on ringed seals, it's potentially a relatively new phenomena. It seems unlikely that it could be in any way beneficial to promoting pupping success. And future projections of sea ice and snow suggest that snow might get deeper while the ice gets thinner, which may mean that more seal layers are likely to flood in the future. And lastly, the question that came up while the project was underway, why was there so little sea ice in Kotzebue Sound in 2018 and 19? Our measurements from the sea ice and the ocean in the channel in front of Kotzebue tell us that it was heat from the ocean that slowed the ice growth in the channel and promoted melt of that ice. And we therefore think that that heat was residual heat left over from the summertime, solar heat that was absorbed into the ocean during the open water season that was not released to the atmosphere completely during the freeze-up process, and then therefore lingered during the wintertime and was able to continue thinning and slowing ice growth throughout the winter. So that is that concludes my talk. I started out with what I've learned about thinking about CS from an Indigenous perspective, how we created a research design in partnership with a council of Indigenous experts, and then how we were able to directly answer, in this case, just 3 of the 6 questions that came up, but these are just the research projects that are currently have been submitted as papers for review. But we do expect to address each one of those 6 questions in part as we conclude this project. So with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions that come up.
Thanks, Andy. So I have a question. Why is it you as a sea ice geophysicist want to work with Indigenous people and seek out to work with Indigenous people?
The simplest answer is I have questions and I certainly don't have all the answers. And I think initially I would go to members of the Indigenous community to answer the questions that I've had. What I have found over time is I need to go to members of the Indigenous community to find out what questions I should ask.
Yeah, thanks. So we have Annika, did you want to do the questions or?
I just saw Karen Großkreuz raised her hand. I probably said that very German, but if you're still online, I saw you raise your hand early in the talk. So if you want to ask a question, go ahead. Okay.
And I can stop sharing my screen too if folks want to sort of see more people on the screen rather than just my slides.
Yeah, maybe we do that. That's nice. That's nice. Margaret, go ahead.
So one of the first questions we have you spoken with Inuit who have knowledge of the 3 migrations from Russia through Alaska and Canada to Greenland?
When I was a part of the Siku Inuit Healer project that linked together communities from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, migration came up as a common topic. I'm certainly no expert in it, and partly because of that, I probably forgot a lot of what I was told and learned. But I do know that it's a topic of great interest to people from communities, and a lot of the stories they tell describe how much travel and how much back and forth migration has gone along around the Arctic, but it hasn't directly impacted any of the research questions that I have asked yet, but it's certainly something that I've been exposed to through Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thanks. I think another one more related to your recent project in Kotzebue is, were you able to include elders from Noatak on the passage of sea ice/icing on the Noatak River as a way to determine transportation and hunting impacts?
We didn't have anyone from the village of Noatak on this project. It was focused in this case specifically on Kotzebue, which in partly was a logistical constraint, but we found that the communities are quite interconnected, and people have relatives with other communities up rivers like Noatak and in the community of Noatak. So we were able to learn some about those interactions that different communities have. But we didn't have anyone specifically from Noatak on our advisory council.
An interesting question just came in from Sarah Trainer. Can you speak to if and how your research design is different from when you started with questions from the community versus starting with questions from science? How did you figure out the process by which you would go about answering the research questions that were identified in your collaborative process?
I guess we did have to ask the first questions, and some of those questions we tried to make as general as possible. And one of the questions I mentioned was, we asked the elders, what would you do if you could have an eye in the sky over different parts of Kotzebue Sound? What questions would you like to ask? And I think that's why we ended up labeling it question 0. The first question they asked was, they wanted to know what species were outside of Kotzebue Sound at a time when they didn't have any other way of knowing that themselves. The ice isn't safe enough to get out there to go see for yourself. And so that really isn't a question that we would have come up with ourselves, because we maybe didn't have that curiosity and drive to ask that question. But once we started getting into that question, we realized how many different aspects of understanding the sea ice and the marine mammals had to come together before we'd even be able to come up with a research design to address that question. So I think we came up with much more. Each question had a lot more packed into it than I think maybe scientists were often designed to be reductionist, and we come up with these very simple yes, no testable hypotheses. We came up with questions that required a lot more unpacking before we could start trying to come up with a research design to address them. And that, I think, was quite a different process than I've followed with a purely academic collaboration team.
Maybe I can ask a question that was sent to me privately, and it was, Andy, how would you recommend beginning this co-production process if you don't have the grant support for a 1-year-long development process?
That's a great question, and it's kind of a catch-22. You know, in order to sort of get to the position where I was able to convince a funding agency, and I say I, there's sort of we. I'm saying I really mean we. This was very much a team approach, where our team could convince the funding agency to fund this, was partly because our research team on the academic side was at the career stage where we could sort of have that leverage with a funding agency. As a early career scientist, I don't have a great answer. It's a difficult thing still, and I think we need, as a scientific community, to find a mechanism that allows you to do this sort of research at an early career stage without having to have already spent 20 years studying your subject matter, learning how to work with communities along the way. So I'm afraid I don't have a magic answer to that, but I do think it's one that our community needs to strive for.
Corey Erickson wants to ask the next question. I think he'll unmute. And I also want to make sure Corey is our next speaker. So I did put the RSVP in the chat earlier.
Hey guys. Hey Andy.
Hey Corey.
Old friends. How's it going? My question has to do with relevancy of research, and this is, I'm sure people who have heard me speak before, I've talked about this before, but obviously sea ice research is very relevant to local lives. Do you have any advice for early career or early project folks who might not have that level of relevancy with the community? Do you think this model will work as well?
Our project definitely benefited from the fact that there's a lot of general interest in sea ice in the community of Kotzebue, and I found this in Uphiagvik as well. I guess I haven't worked in other disciplines enough to know if there's a quick answer, but I think this is where there's some legwork that is unavoidable that needs to be done to identify what the research questions are that are of relevance to the community. And I think as a scientific community, we have to understand that not all of our research, no matter how well formed the research questions are, no matter how important we think it is, it's not always going to gain instant traction in a community. And part of that might be messaging. We need to learn how to explain the community relevance better, but I'm sure there are still some research questions that don't have the ability to engage a community like in a community like Kotzebue or Uphiagvik. Sea ice is a very popular subject matter. You may end up needing to find the community that matches your research interests. If you have a very specific expertise and interest yourself, you might try to find the community that matches rather than trying to force a match that might not be productive. And I guess I'm saying that from personal experience. If anyone else has a different perspective on that, I would love to hear. This is something and I think the research community need to address. But thanks, Craig. That was a great question.
We had another question sent someone personally in the chat. I'm curious about the initiation process of this kind of research. How do you create and maintain relationships with communities? And are they expected to come to you with interest in working together? Are there boundary organizations that you work with? What lessons could be applied in other areas of the world? And what suggestions to funders do you have?
Gosh, there was a lot in there. I'll try and, if you can help me keep track of all the parts of that question, Margaret. The question started with an initiation process. And here I should really give a huge shout out to Alex Whiting from Kotzebue. I don't know if he's online for this, but Alex really made this project possible. I had some interactions and email exchanges with him in the past. That was, I think, how I knew that CS was going to be a topic of interest to the people of Kotzebue. But Alex was the person who really was I'm going to borrow your word here, Margaret, the boundary spanner that connected our research interests and expertise with folks in the community who shared those interests from an Indigenous perspective. And so I think people like Alex are essential to this process. Maybe over time, by the time I'm gray bearded and rounding out my career, I'll have some of the background that Alex has, to where I can span a boundary somehow like Alex can. But that's sort of impractical that we can all do that, especially not at an early career stage. So people like Alex are essential. So I think there was a question there about how funding agencies can be encouraged to do this. Support people like Alex, and there's others in other communities. I don't want to put this all on the shoulders of people like that. So we need to provide the support that they can do that job, and be effective, and we can all learn.
Yeah, thanks. And Alex works for the IRA for Kotzebue, right? And so that would be kind of the boundary organization was the question. Yeah. Is that everything?
We had one question early in the talk that is, have you spoken with Inuit who have knowledge of the 3 migrations from Russia through Alaska and Canada to Greenland, Andy? That was when you showed the slide of the freedom of travel.
Oh, I think he already answered that.
Yeah, I think I did partly answer that earlier.
Yeah.
That topic came up a lot in those 3 communities. I haven't addressed it myself. Actually, the Russia connection came up when I was in Kotzebue. And I guess historically there have been times when Chukotkin people from the Russian side would actually come over to Kotzebue and take part in shared cultural activities. But I believe that hasn't happened for a while, and the current political climate doesn't look like it's favorable for that, which is a great shame.
So it's 1 o'clock now. I have a couple more questions if you want to stay on, or if we could wrap up, and yeah.
I can stay on for a couple more questions.
Okay. So we had one, what are the practical differences between different species of seals you mentioned? Was one question.
So what are the practical differences?
Yeah. Not quite sure.
Well, so bearded seal and ringed seals, and this is where I'm in danger of getting out of my depth here. Like I'm not a marine mammal biologist, but one of the enjoyable things about working on projects like this is you get to learn stuff outside of your field. So ringed seals are adapted to live in land-fast ice, so the sort of continuous ice that's not moving, doesn't have very many cracks and openings in it. And they live in layers under the snow, protected from predators where they give birth to their young. Bearded seals live out largely in the pack ice, where there are natural openings in the ice that they can use to get up for air and to get up and down between the ice and the water. And so they're not always, they're not often found together, particularly in wintertime. Ringed seals will be in the land fast ice. Bearded seals will be in the pack ice. And therefore they have different hunting seasons and different places you go to hunt them. But I'm very, I gotta say, I'm feeling very self-conscious talking about this when I know there are people listening in who do go out hunting for ring seals and bearded seals, nakchik and ugrok. So I'm a little embarrassed to say any more than that.
And then the last one I have, unless anyone has a question that's still here, was more of a comment from Falk Huterman. And it says, talking about the slide with research design for community-based work. What I'm lacking here is the use of AI and machine learning in actual analysis. I assume we all agree that parsimony is counterproductive and not to be done, e.g. AIC or p-values, or the classic experiment and hypothesis. I see wide absence of those issues in these fields. Same applies to open access data sharing to assure transparency and repeatability. Now, what is progress then, I wonder? And yes, there are other issues with paid informants and with white scientists too. That's my comment. I don't know if you want to scroll up and actually like read it. It's a lot.
Yeah, okay, so I'm looking at that question now. I guess there is no AI or machine learning approach that we've used. Although we have collected vast amounts of data, aerial photography of different types of ice and different types of seals, and I'm sure AI and machine learning could be put to use in coming up with an algorithm that automatically identifies when there's a seal on the ice and recognizes what category of ice that seal is occupying or something. So I think we could use those tools for that sort of thing, but I don't think it's a general tool that has to be applied in all cases, which is why it wasn't on that slide. I will address the fact that we didn't present our research questions as hypotheses, and that was a sort of a difference that I touched on. I think it was Sarah Trainer asked the question, how was the research process different than it would have been without working with an Indigenous Advisory Council? And our research questions were a lot more multifaceted than we could have broken each one down into a series of hypotheses. But we didn't do that because that's not the way the questions arose, and that's not the way in which the Indigenous knowledge that underlaid those questions is put together. This sort of formalism of hypothesis testing, I think it's a valid approach for some types of science, but honestly, very little of my own personal research is hypothesis driven. So we didn't actually specifically include hypotheses in addition to our research questions. We thought the research question structure was more compatible with the integration of Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, thanks. Any last questions?
Good job, Andy.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Kari. Good to see you. Good to see Mike Thomas there in the background of your video too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. I'm gonna end the recording.